the finger of death, the searchlight beam of a Japanese destroyer, slid across the black water, blinding and merciless. He passed within a few feet of our nose, and we froze, holding our breath, turning into a silent ghost, drifting in the pitch darkness off the coast of Vela La Vela. 23 American sailors huddled against the deck of the PT-164, pressing themselves into the rough wood, trying to become invisible, to disappear into the night and into the fear that tickled the spine. In the holds of the 3 Japanese transports that followed this destroyer, there were almost 8,000 enemy soldiers who did not even suspect that their path to reinforce the Kolombangara garrison was about to end in the black, ruthless waters of the Solomon Sea. The date on the calendar was July 19th, 1943, and in exactly 4 minutes we were about to bring hell down from the pitch darkness. My hands gripped the handles of the Sparky 50 caliber machine guns so tightly that my knuckles turned white and burned with a dull pain, merging with the general tension that was in the air, thick as tar. Next to me, in the cramped control room, Anson Robert Dutch Vanderberg, our navigator, was dictating coordinates to our captain, Lieutenant Commander Arthur M. McPherson, almost soundlessly, in a whisper that could only be heard in headphones or in the tense silence of the bridge. The phosphorescent green light of our compass was the only source of illumination we could afford. It cast ghostly shadows on their concentrated faces, turning them into the faces of underwater gods who decide the fate of mortals. Behind us, hidden in the moon's shadow cast by the volcanic peaks of Vela La Vela, PT-168 and PT-171 stood in ambush, waiting for our signal. We were America's secret weapon, her dagger in the back of the Imperial Navy, and the Japanese had to find out today why darkness was no longer their ally. My name is Chief Petty Officer Thomas Tom Harrigan, United States Naval Reserve, and I was one of those who proved from my own experience that small wooden boats can sink steel warships. People often ask me what it was like to be part of the most closely guarded naval secret of 1943. The truth is, we were too busy just not dying to think about making history. All we knew was that if we failed tonight, those 8,000 Japanese soldiers would reach Kolombangara, where they would slaughter the American guys trying to capture that strategic airfield. Every torpedo we carried on board represented hundreds of American lives that might be saved. Every enemy transport we sent to the bottom meant parents back home who would not receive that terrible telegram from the War Department that made my mother's legs give way and my father go into a silent, hopeless rage. To understand how 3 boats, smaller than most private yachts, could challenge the Imperial Japanese Navy at the peak of its power, we need to understand what we faced in the summer of 1943. The Japanese turned night fighting into an art form. After their victory off Savo Island the previous August, where they sank 4 Allied cruisers without losing a single ship, they reigned supreme in the Solomon Islands. Their sailors had been training for years in night combat, learning to fight without radar, relying only on keen eyesight and honed coordination. They called their overnight shipments Tokyo Express, and we called them rat shipments. Anyway, they moved troops and supplies with almost complete impunity as soon as the sun disappeared below the horizon. The American Navy had bigger ships, better radars, and higher firepower, but we were losing the night war. Our admirals, brought up on the traditional tactics of line battles at Jutland and in Manila Bay, could not adapt quickly enough to this new form of warfare. Our cruisers and destroyers, designed for naval battles in the open ocean, turned into unwieldy targets in the cramped waters of the Solomon Islands. We needed something different, something that the Japanese had never expected. And this something was built in secret shipyards from New Orleans to New York, and it changed naval art forever. The PT Patrol Torpedo Boat, a torpedo boat, was born of desperation and American ingenuity. 80 feet long and 20 feet wide, they were built of laminated mahogany plywood, not steel. 3 Packard 5M2500 engines, modified versions of the Liberty aircraft engine, accelerated them to speeds of over 45 knots, faster than any destroyer or cruiser. We carried 4 21-inch Mark 13 torpedo tubes, 1 20mm Oerlikon cannon, 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns, and enough ammunition to create hell for about 15 minutes of continuous combat. After that, we had to either set a course back or go to the bottom. I first saw a PT boat in February 1943 at the Torpedo Boat Squadron Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. I was a sailor from a destroyer who had just returned from convoy duty in the North Atlantic when the Navy announced the recruitment of volunteers to serve on high-risk experimental vessels. The recruiter did not tell us what kind of vessels they were, only mentioned that the expected loss rate was over 50%. 40 out of 200 volunteers were selected. I was selected because I could navigate by the stars and had the experience of operating small boats that I gained as a child on the Chesapeake Bay. The first time I set foot on the deck of the PT-164, I thought the Navy had gone completely nuts. It was not a warship. It was an enlarged racing motorboat with delusions of grandeur. The building was made of wood, wooden in a war where steel and armor ruled. The living quarters were so cramped that hot beds were not just commonplace, but a harsh necessity. No armor protection, except for a few sheets of metal around the cabin. One lucky hit from something bigger than a rifle bullet, and will turn into splinters floating on the water. But then I met McPherson, and everything changed. Mac was 28 years old. By the standards of the PT boat crews, he was considered an ancient old man, and his eyes had already seen too much. He was on the destroyer USS Shore at Pearl Harbor during the Japanese attack, fought at Midway, and joined torpedo boats because, as he himself said, "I'm tired of being a target. It's time to become a hunter." Mac understood something that the rest of us would only have to realize after weeks of training. PT boats were not built for combat like regular warships. We were naval guerrillas, ocean-going assassins who struck from ambush and disappeared before the enemy had time to react. Our crew was a hodgepodge of losers and specialists who would never have served together on an ordinary warship. Dutch Vanderberg, our senior assistant, was a mathematics professor at Yale who could calculate the data for launching torpedoes in his head faster than most people could handle a slide rule. Chief Mechanic Carlos Charlie Mendoza had assembled racing engines in Los Angeles before the war and was able to make our moody Packards purr like kittens or roar like lions, depending on what was needed. Radio operator second class William Sparks Patterson served on submarines, where he learned to work with the radio in absolute silence. Our torpedo officer, gunnery officer first class Patrick Paddy O'Brien, was a real artist in handling these mechanical fish. Each Mark 13 torpedo weighed 2,200 pounds and cost like a whole house somewhere in the homeland. Paddy treated them better than most men treated their wives, constantly tweaking, grooming, and cajoling them. "These beauties," he said, polishing the bronze propellers, "are the only reason the Japs will take us seriously. One shot is one goal, otherwise we're just an expensive training exercise." The rest of our 12-man crew included 2 more gunners, a mechanic, a cook who performed the duties of a medic, and 3 sailors who did the rest. We were black and white, guys from the city and from farms, undergraduates and college graduates, united by one simple fact. We were all volunteers who signed a contract in the full knowledge that we probably would not survive this war. The training in Melville was brutal and ruthless. The Navy has learned from the early losses of PT boats and realized that enthusiasm alone is not enough. We needed to be faster, smarter, and fiercer than anything the Japanese could throw at us. We practiced attacks at high speed until we learned how to accurately fire torpedoes while bouncing on the waves at 40 knots. We learned to navigate by sound and instinct when tropical downpours reduced visibility to 0. And most importantly, we learned to think like pirates, not like sailors. Commander James Wild Jim Patterson, who led the training program, survived the campaign in the Philippines and left Corregidor on one of the last PT boats to leave there. His teaching philosophy was simple. The Japanese expect you to fight fairly. Don't live up to their expectations. They expect you to follow naval traditions. Don't do this. They expect you to be afraid of the dark. Make them afraid instead of you. He taught us that our most formidable weapons are not torpedoes, but surprise, speed, and reckless audacity. We arrived at our forward base in Rendovo on June 30th, 1943, just as the invasion of New Georgia was beginning. The base was little more than a fuel depot, several camouflaged Quonset tents, and a crude pier covered in palm branches. The first thing we felt was the smell: rotting vegetation, diesel fuel, and the sweet, cloying stench of tropical decomposition. The second is the sound of artillery cannonade from New Georgia, where Marines were dying trying to capture the Munda airfield. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9, our unit, consisted of 12 PT boats, whose task was to stop any attempts by the Japanese to transfer reinforcements to the central part of the Solomon Islands. Our mission sounded simple: to patrol the waters between major Japanese bases and sink everything that bears the flag of the rising sun. The reality was much more complicated. These waters were a maze of coral reefs, volcanic islands, and hidden Japanese strongholds. The enemy had seaplanes for reconnaissance, observers on every major island, and destroyer squadrons specially trained to hunt PT boats. Our first patrol on July 5th turned into a disaster. 3 boats, including ours, tried to intercept a Japanese convoy near Visu. We were spotted by an enemy seaplane even before we managed to take up an attack position. And suddenly, 4 destroyers were rushing at us with shining searchlights and cannon volleys. We scattered like rabbits, escaping through the stockade of splashes from the shells. The PT-158 received a direct hit from a 5-inch shell and simply disappeared, crumbled to pieces. 12 people disappeared in the blink of an eye, torn into fragments along with their boat. We spent 4 hours dodging among the reefs and islands until we finally broke free. Not a single torpedo was fired, not a single damaged enemy ship, and we lost a boat and crew. That night, when Mac gathered at our base in Rendau, he brought us together. "We learned something important today," he said quietly. "We can't fight them the way destroyers fight each other. We are not made for artillery duels. We strike from ambush, or we don't strike at all." It was a hard lesson, paid for in blood, but it defined each subsequent mission. Over the next 2 weeks, we developed new tactics through trial and error. We have learned to use the radar shadow of the islands to hide our approach. We found that turning off 2 engines and running on 1 dramatically reduces our noise levels. And most importantly, we figured out how to coordinate the attacks of several boats using simple light signals that the Japanese could not intercept. The intelligence network that supported us was amazing. Australian coastal observers, hiding in the mountains of the Japanese-occupied islands, radioed the movements of enemy ships. Local residents of the Solomon Islands, risking being executed if caught, sailed out in their canoes to meet with us and pass on information about the Japanese positions. Sometimes we received information from decoded interceptions from Pearl Harbor, where we were informed of the exact convoy schedule, but for the most part we hunted based on instinct and experience. In July 1943, PT boats were still classified weapons. In official Navy reports, we were never mentioned by name, being referred to only as small vessels or mosquito fleet. The Japanese knew that something was hitting their convoys, but their initial reports described us as submarines or mines. They couldn't believe that the Americans were sending wooden speedboats against steel warships. This ignorance was our greatest advantage. On the evening of July 18th, a message was received from a coastal observer. "A large Japanese convoy with reinforcements will pass through the Blackett Strait, heading for Villa on Kolombangara." That was the goal we were waiting for. Several transports with minimal security, forced to pass through narrow waters where their superior numbers would not matter. Mac volunteered to lead our boat in the attack, along with PT-168 under the command of Lieutenant Henry Hank Bramwell and PT-171 under the command of Lieutenant Junior Rank Joseph Joey Antonelli. The briefing that evening was intense. According to intelligence reports, the convoy consisted of 3 large transports escorted by 1 or 2 destroyers, carrying units of the Japanese 13th Regiment, elite troops fighting in China and the Philippines. These were not construction battalions or logistics units. These were the first-line soldiers who would have made a hell of a life for our Marines on New Georgia. Commander William Bill Specht, our squadron commander, made it clear, "Gentlemen, this convoy must not reach Vila. I don't care if you have to ram these transports. They should go to the bottom tonight." When the sun set on July 19th, turning the sky over the Solomon Islands blood red, we were completing the final preparations. Paddy O'Brien tested his torpedoes for the 5th time, setting a travel depth of 10 feet and a speed of 28 knots for the Mark 13, the optimal settings for hitting a loaded transport. Charlie Mendoza brought our engines to perfection by installing mufflers to reduce noise. Dutch Vandenberg plotted the course of attack over and over again, calculating the currents, the wind, and the position of the moon. I checked my machine guns one last time, making sure that the cartridge belts were being fed without delay. We loaded only armor-piercing and incendiary cartridges. Conventional bullets were useless against steel ships, while armor-piercing incendiary bullets could pierce cabin windows, cause fires, and overwhelm enemy crews. Every 5th round was tracer, creating lines of fire similar to deadly fireworks in the night sky. At 20:30 we cast off the mooring lines and went out into the gathering dusk. 3 boats were moving in the wake, engines muted to a low rumble. When we passed Rendover Harbor, Mac ordered the weapons to be checked. The night briefly exploded into flames as 12 machine guns and 3 20mm cannons barked into the empty sea. Then silence fell again, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of our engines and the hissing of water along the sides. The ocean was more choppy than we had hoped, with a 2-foot wave, which posed problems for the accuracy of the torpedoes. But it also meant that our wake jets would be harder to spot, and the waves would drown out the noise of the engines. Every advantage mattered when you were 80 feet of plywood attacking 400 feet of steel. By 23 Car, we reached our ambush position off the northern coast of Vella La Vella. Mac turned off the engines to idle, and we drifted in the dark, waiting. The only sounds were the splashing of water against the hull and the distant rumble of artillery from New Georgia. Then, at 23:47, Sparks Patterson intercepted a transmission from a shore observer. 3 large ships, 2 escorts, bearing 280, speed 18 knots, distance 15 miles from your position. The hunt has begun. Mac started 2 engines, keeping them low while we moved to intercept. The math was simple, but crucial. The enemy convoy was traveling at a speed of 18 knots on a steady course. We could make 35 knots without creating too much of a wake. If we position ourselves correctly, we will intercept them just as they enter the narrowest part of the Blackett Strait, where they will have no room to maneuver. At 00:18 on July 20th, Dutch spotted them through binoculars, dark silhouettes against the starry sky, exactly where they were supposed to be. The Japanese kept an impeccable formation. 2 destroyers in the lead, 3 transports following, and another destroyer bringing up the rear. They didn't show lights, but their size and correct spacing made them easy targets to track if you knew where to look. Mac's plan was elegantly simple and incredibly dangerous. PT-168 will attack from the port side, PT-171 from the starboard side, and we will go right in the middle, behind the main transport. This meant passing between the escort destroyers, literally threading a needle between death on both sides, but if successful, we would have caused maximum confusion and would have received clear shots at all 3 transports. "Full speed ahead, slow down," Mac whispered. We crawled at 5 knots, barely moving, allowing the convoy to approach us. From 2,000 yards away, we could already hear their engines, the low hum of massive diesels pushing thousands of tons through the water. From 1 to 500 yards away, we could make out individual details: the pagoda-shaped conning tower of the lead destroyer, the cargo booms of the transports, even the figures moving along the deck. From 1,000 yards away, Mac gave the signal. 3 clicks on the radio, and all 3 PT boats simultaneously shot forward. Our engines roared from idle to full in a matter of seconds, lifting our nose out of the water as we accelerated to attack. The night split as we charged at the enemy convoy at 40 knots. 3 small boats challenged the steel giants. The Japanese were completely taken by surprise. Their observers, trained to spot submarines or approaching destroyers, had no idea the attackers were moving so fast and at such close range. We were inside their formation even before they had time to react, zipping between the escorting destroyers at point-blank range. I opened fire with my twin Brownings, combing the control room of the nearest destroyer, seeing my tracers bite into the windows and ricochet off the steel. Fire 1, fire 2. Paddy fired our first 2 Mark 13 torpedoes from a range of 600 yards. It was an impossibly close range, where a miss was almost impossible. The mechanical fish jumped out of the pipes and plopped into the water, their propellers already spinning at full speed. Double trails of phosphorescent bubbles rushed towards the target, a converted passenger liner with more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers on board. The destroyer on our starboard side finally reacted by pointing its searchlight at us. A blinding white beam found us instantly, burning out our retinas. Immediately, their 25mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The green tracers reached out to us like deadly fingers. The shells were falling all around us, so close that the spray drenched everyone on deck. And then our torpedoes hit the target. The first hit the transport just behind the control room with a deafening explosion that lit up the night like lightning. The second hit him in the middle, instantly breaking the ship's spine. The 8,000-ton vessel partially rose from the water and then broke in half. Both parts immediately began to sink. Through the blinding glare of searchlights and gunfire, we saw hundreds of Japanese soldiers pouring into the water. Their screams could be heard even over the roar of our engines. PT-168 struck next. Both Mark 13 torpedoes crashed into the second transport. That ship, loaded with ammunition and fuel for the Vila garrison, exploded like a volcano. The explosion was so powerful that it knocked me off my feet, and a wave of superheated air washed over our boat. Burning debris rained down around us, causing small fires on our wooden deck, which we violently trampled. The Japanese destroyers were responding now, but they were faced with an unsolvable problem. We were too close for their main guns to sink low enough to hit us, and we mixed in with their own transports, making it dangerous for them to fire themselves. Their solution was to try to ram us, using their size advantage to simply run us over. The nearest destroyer turned sharply in our direction, its sharp nose pointed directly at our side. At our combined approach speed, we had maybe 10 seconds before impact. Mac turned the steering wheel all the way to the right and pushed the controls beyond the stops. Our engines howled in protest, but we turned around like a ballerina, missing the destroyer's bow less than 10 feet away from us. As we raced past, I emptied the entire band of cartridges into their wheelhouse at point-blank range, seeing how sparks were struck when bullets hit. PT-171 was less fortunate. Joey Antonelli lined up perfect shots at the third transport, but the Japanese destroyer caught them in the searchlights before they could fire. The enemy's 25mm cannons found their target, gouging a line of holes along the nose of the PT-171. One shell hit the torpedo, but by a happy coincidence, it did not detonate. The warhead needed to spin in the water before it could explode. However, Joey had to break off his attack and run, emitting smoke and taking on water. We turned around for a new approach, but the element of surprise was lost. Every searchlight in the Japanese convoy was now combing the water, and guns of all calibers were firing in all directions. The water around us was churned up with so many splashes that it seemed like a downpour had started. Worse, The Japanese had finally deployed their 5-inch guns, and they could have blown us to smithereens with a single hit. "Let the other fish out and get us out of here," shouted Mac over the din. Paddy fired our last 2 Mark 13 torpedoes at the remaining transport, but the captain of that ship saw them coming and managed to comb their tracks by turning in parallel so that both torpedoes passed harmlessly along his sides. And then we were running, all 3 engines at maximum power, weaving between bursts of projectiles as we fled into the darkness. Behind us, the battle continued to rage. The PT-168, despite several hits, managed to put another torpedo into the already sinking second transport. The agony of the ammunition ship lit up the entire strait. Secondary explosions rolled through her hull as she sank to the bottom. 2 of the 3 transports were destroyed, taking with them almost 6,000 Japanese soldiers. The 3rd transport and the destroyers were not damaged, but they were thoroughly shaken. We regrouped 5 miles south of the collision site. All 3 boats were battered, but still afloat. The PT-171 was in the worst possible condition, with multiple holes near the waterline and 1 engine out of order. We went side by side and helped to transfer the injured crew members, while our carpenters worked furiously, sealing the holes with everything they could, from mattresses to life jackets. The PT-168 lost its radio antenna and suffered shrapnel damage throughout the superstructure, but remained operational. Our boat somehow escaped with minimal damage. Several shrapnel holes, the burnt-out barrel of a machine gun from overheating, and scorch marks from close explosions. But we were alive, and we accomplished our mission. 2 transports were definitely sunk. Thousands of enemy soldiers have been killed, and the schedule of Japanese reinforcements has been disrupted. The surviving transport, instead of continuing on its way to Villa, turned back and headed for Rabaul. The journey back to the base was stressful. Japanese seaplanes rose at first light in search of us. We hid in the shadows of small islands, camouflaged by palm branches, with our engines off, barely breathing, while enemy planes buzzed overhead. It took us 14 hours to complete what should have been a 3-hour journey, but we all returned to Rendover. The debriefing was exhaustive. The intelligence officers wanted to know every detail: Japanese tactics, weapon effectiveness, enemy reaction time. What we told them will be distributed to all PT boat squadrons in the Pacific Ocean. The lessons learned from our encounter will save American lives and sink enemy ships throughout the remaining years of the war. But the immediate impact was even more significant. Interceptions of radio communications revealed Japanese reports describing new American secret weapons and high-speed torpedo boats appearing out of nowhere. For the first time, the Imperial Navy was afraid of the dark. They could no longer move freely at night, and they could not guarantee safe passage even to their most heavily guarded convoys. Every shadow could hide a PT boat. Every sound could be American engines approaching. Over the following weeks, the Japanese changed their entire supply strategy. Convoys have become larger, but less frequent. The number of escorting destroyers doubled and then tripled. They began using searchlight-equipped seaplanes for night reconnaissance. All these changes meant that fewer supplies and reinforcements reached their island garrisons, giving our ground forces a decisive advantage. The psychological impact may have been even greater than the tactical success. The Japanese soldiers, waiting for reinforcements that never arrived, began to lose hope. Enemy commanders, unable to guarantee the delivery of supplies, were forced to cancel offensive operations. The myth of Japanese invincibility at night, shattered by wooden boats manned by American teenagers and reservists, began to crumble across the Pacific Ocean. The success of our squadron has led to a rapid expansion of the PT boat program. New bases have been established throughout the Solomon Islands archipelago and in New Guinea. Improved boats with better engines, radars, and armor protection were urgently put into production. The tactics we developed through trial and error became the official doctrine taught at training bases from Rhode Island to California. The price of this success was measured in the friends who did not return home. 2 weeks after our successful attack, PT-166 hit a mine while returning from patrol. The entire crew was killed. PT-162 was captured by Japanese destroyers during the daytime when an engine failure left her immobilized. They shot her to pieces. Only 3 survivors were picked up from the water. Joey Antonelli, the captain of PT-171, was killed by a sniper while his boat was refueling at the forward base. By October 1943, when I was recalled to the States for training on new ships, our squadron had lost 7 boats and 73 men. But we sank or damaged more than 40 Japanese ships, from destroyers to barges, and killed thousands of enemy soldiers who never reached their destinations. The loss ratio was brutal, but necessary. Every PT boat we lost could be replaced. Japanese ships and experienced crews are not. I returned to the Pacific Ocean in March 1944 as the executive officer on PT-321 operating in the Philippines. The boats were better. Radars, armor plates around the cockpit, more reliable torpedoes. But the essence remained the same: speed, surprise, and audacity. We continued to prove that American innovation can overcome any enemy advantage. The Japanese have not fully adapted to the threat of PT boats. They've tried everything: specialized hunter-killer groups, radar-equipped destroyers, even suicide boats designed to ram us. But they couldn't be everywhere, couldn't protect every convoy, couldn't make the night safe again. The secret weapon they discovered too late changed the balance of power in the Pacific forever. A.M. McPherson survived the war, earning the Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars. He remained in the Navy, eventually commanding a destroyer squadron in Korea. We kept in touch until his death in 1987. At his funeral, my son told me that Mac often said that he learned what true courage was on PT boats. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of terror. Dutch Vandenberg returned to Yale after the war, but he never forgot the navigation lessons he learned in the Solomon Islands. He became one of America's leading oceanographers, using skills honed while evading Japanese destroyers to map ocean currents and seamounts. He once told me that after fighting his way between enemy ships at 40 knots in the dark, everything else seemed easy. Charlie Mendoza returned to assembling racing engines in Los Angeles, applying tricks learned while maintaining PT boat motors to make cars go faster. His garage has become a legend among hot rodders, with a sign that reads, "Speed Specialists. We made PT boats fly." He told clients that if he could get 4,500 horsepower to push 50 tons at 45 knots, then he could make anything move fast. Paddy O'Brien remained in the Navy, becoming one of the service's leading experts on torpedoes. He wrote the Mark 13 Torpedo Maintenance Manual, which was used up until the 1970s. But he never forgot the torpedoes we fired that night at Vela La Vela. "It was my fish that sank those transports," he said proudly. 2 shots, 2 hits, 6,000 Japanese who never got around to killing Americans. The history of PT boats often remains in the shadow of the larger battles of World War II, Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf. But for those of us who served on these tiny wooden warriors, we knew we were part of something revolutionary. We have proven that technology and courage can overcome tradition and size. We have shown that American sailors, many of whom have never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor, can beat the best navy in the world at their own game. The secret of our success lay not so much in the boats themselves, although they were wonders of engineering, and not in our torpedoes, although when they worked, they were devastating. The real secret was the American spirit of innovation, the willingness to try something completely different when conventional methods failed. While our admirals initially rejected PT boats as toys, junior officers and enlisted men proved that toys with teeth can change the course of war. Every time I read about modern naval warfare, missile boats, stealth technology, asymmetric warfare, I see the legacy of those PT boats. We have proven that naval combat should not be limited to battleships exchanging blows from 20,000 yards. It can be associated with speed and stealth, striking where the enemy is not expecting and disappearing before they can respond. Every high-speed combat boat in today's fleet carries the DNA of those plywood speedboats that terrorized the Japanese Navy. The Japanese phrase that entered their naval vocabulary in 1943 was simply mosquito fleet terror, a fear that spread throughout their fleet. Post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers showed that PT boats caused destruction far exceeding our actual numbers. They were forced to assume that we were everywhere. They were forced to plan against attacks that might never happen. We were forced to spend resources on protection from threats that could turn out to be shadows. Admiral Tanaka Raizo, who commanded many Tokyo Express flights, wrote after the war, "American PT boats were our worst nightmare. We could hunt submarines with depth charges. We could see the planes approaching. But these devilish boats appeared out of nowhere, struck like cobras, and disappeared into the night. They made us afraid of our own element, the darkness that we once owned. The fear, the uncertainty that we created, was worth more than any number of sunk ships. This represented a turning point when the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific Ocean since Pearl Harbor, began to doubt itself. When the sailors who had trained all their lives for night combat began to fear shadows, the psychological battle had already been won. The technical evolution of PT boats during the war was amazing. Early boats like ours were essentially pre-war projects crammed into combat service. By 1945, PT boats carried radars, missiles, advanced torpedoes, and even primitive guided missiles. But the basic concept has never changed. Small, fast, deadly, and brutal, staffed by volunteers willing to take insane risks for their country. One story that captures the spirit of PT boats occurred in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. A squadron of PT boats, hopelessly outgunned, attacked the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. Their torpedoes couldn't even penetrate the Yamato's armor belt, but they attacked anyway, forcing the massive battleship to take evasive maneuvers and buying time for the American escort carriers to escape. The small boats did not sink the giant that day, but their courage saved American lives. The PT boat bases themselves have become legends. Rendova, Tulagi, Moresby, Vunedi, exotic names that meant mosquitoes, malaria, and night missions. It wasn't Pearl Harbor or San Diego with their officers' clubs and clean sheets. These were dirty holes where we lived on Spam and cigarettes, where mail went on for months, where the only entertainment was poker and rumors. But morale remained high because we knew we were making a difference. The local people of the Solomon Islands deserve special recognition. They risked everything to help us, guiding us through the reefs, rescuing downed pilots and shipwrecked sailors, and providing intelligence on Japanese movements. Many were executed when they were caught helping the Americans. Their courage and sacrifice were essential to our success. Without their help, we would be blind and lost in those island labyrinths. The shore watchers, those lone volunteers hiding on Japanese-occupied islands with radio stations and binoculars, were our guardian angels. They reported, 40 bombers are heading towards you, or a squadron of destroyers is moving south at high speed. Many times, their warnings saved our bases from a surprise attack, or helped us get into position for a perfect ambush. We had never met most of them, but we owed them our lives. One technological advance that revolutionized PT boat operations was radar. The first installations were so primitive that it was difficult to distinguish an island from a ship. But by the end of 1944, we could track targets in total darkness and fog. The Japanese, who relied on excellent night vision and training, suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. We could see them before they could see us. The ultimate advantage in night combat. The evolution of our tactics has been constant. We learned how to use strips of aluminum foil to confuse Japanese radars. We have developed the tactics of wolf packs, coordinating the attacks of several boats from different directions. We figured out how to use coastal batteries as a distraction, forcing the enemy to reveal their positions by shooting at false targets while we were maneuvering for a real attack. The most dangerous missions were the ones that no one had heard of. The landing of coastal observers behind enemy lines, the evacuation of encircled Marines from cut-off beaches, and the delivery of ammunition to isolated outposts under enemy fire. These were not glamorous torpedo attacks, but exhausting, dangerous work that saved countless lives. We have become the Swiss Army knife of the Navy, used for any job too dangerous or too crazy for ordinary ships. Personal relationships on PT boats were unique in the military environment. On a 300-man destroyer, you may not know everyone's name. On a PT boat with 12 people, you knew everything. Who snores, who has nightmares, who gets motion sickness, who you can rely on when everything goes to hell. This closeness created a bond that lasted a lifetime. My meetings with PT boat veterans decades after the war felt like family gatherings because we were a family shackled in battle. The food on PT boats deserves a special mention, or perhaps complaints. We lived on K-rations, Spam, egg powder, and anything else we could barter for from larger ships. Fresh water was precious, rationed only for drinking. We washed in seawater, which left salt crystals that caused irritation and burning. Coffee, black and so strong that a wrench could float in it, was our life elixir. Some crews became creative, fishing with hand grenades or exchanging torpedo alcohol from the base staff for real food. Maintenance was constant and critical. The seawater corroded everything. The tropical heat was rotting wood and fabric, and high-speed operations were straining every component to the limit. We spent more time servicing our boats than fighting on them. Every man became a mechanic, carpenter, and electrician by necessity. A PT boat with a failed engine in enemy waters was a death trap, so we treated maintenance like a religion. The weather in the Solomon Islands has been our constant enemy. Tropical downpours could appear out of nowhere, turning a calm sea into mountains of water. Lightning strikes could have fried our radios and electrical systems. The heat and humidity were so oppressive that men fainted at their posts. But bad weather was also our friend, hiding us from enemy planes and making our small boats harder to spot amid the wind-driven waves. Navigating those waters required skills that had never been taught in Annapolis. The maps were often incorrect, based on surveys from the 1800s. Coral reefs could appear overnight after storms. We learned to read the color of the water and the patterns of the waves, to smell the earth before seeing it, to navigate by instinct when the devices failed. Each successful patrol added to our mental maps of those deadly waters. The Japanese response to PT boats evolved over the course of the war. They have developed special low-draft destroyers specifically designed to hunt us. They created coordinated search patterns using seaplanes and destroyers together. They even tried to use captured PT boats as decoys. But for every countermeasure they developed, we developed countermeasures. It became a deadly chess game played at 40 knots in the dark. One aspect that is rarely discussed is the psychological burden. Living on the edge all the time, knowing that any patrol could be your last, watching friends die in terrible ways. It marked us all. Some men broke down by requesting transfers, even if it meant being branded cowards. Others became addicted to adrenaline, volunteering for increasingly dangerous missions. Most of us just endured, finding ways to deal with the fear that never really went away. The humor that developed was black, but necessary. We called our boats by names like Sudden Death, Hell's Angels, and Reaper. We drew cartoon characters on our torpedoes. Donald Duck riding a torpedo was popular. We wrote songs about the sinking of Japanese ships. The more gloomy they were, the better. It was a psychological armor, a way to make the unbearable bearable. The influence of PT boats has spread beyond the Pacific Ocean. When the invasion of Normandy was planned, PT boats were included to protect the fleet from German missile boats. The lessons learned in the Solomon Islands have been applied in the Mediterranean, the English Channel, and even in the rivers of Europe. The American PT boat doctrine has influenced naval thinking around the world inspiring similar programs in dozens of fleets. Looking back now, decades later, I'm amazed that we survived. We were basically kids playing with deadly toys in a war that killed millions. We made mistakes that should have killed us. They took risks that still make me shudder. But we also achieved something wonderful. We took an untested concept and turned it into a weapon capable of winning the war. We have proven that American innovation and courage can overcome any obstacle. The legacy of PT boats lives on in today's fleet. Every high-speed combat boat, every special operations boat, every vessel designed to strike and disappear quickly carries the DNA of those original Mosquito boats. The sailors who run them probably don't know about the nights off Vela La Vela or the terror we brought to the Japanese convoys, but they are spiritual descendants who continue the traditions of speed, surprise, and audacity. When people ask me if I'm proud of my service, I tell them about that night on July 20th, 1943. 3 small wooden boats attacked a large enemy convoy and sent thousands of Japanese soldiers to the bottom. We came out of the darkness, as our name suggests, and disappeared before the enemy could respond. We were America's secret weapon, and we changed the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese were stunned not only by our boats, but also by what they represented. The American willingness to innovate, aggressive tactics, and a willingness to risk everything on an untested concept. They had studied our fleet for decades, knew our battleships and aircraft carriers, our traditions and tactics. But they never imagined that we would send wooden speedboats armed with torpedoes to challenge their steel warships. This failure of imagination has cost them dearly. Ultimately, the history of PT boats is a uniquely American story. We took a British concept, equipped it with Packard engines designed for airplanes, armed it with torpedoes originally designed for destroyers, and equipped them with civilians who had never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor. It shouldn't have worked, but it did because we made it work through sheer determination and ingenuity. The last operational PT boat was decommissioned in 1959, replaced by newer, faster, and more capable vessels. But for those of us who served on them in World War II, they will forever remain the boats that won the war in the Pacific. We proved that size does not determine victory, that courage is more important than armor, and that American sailors on wooden boats can defeat anyone, anywhere, anytime. As I finish this story, sitting in my office, surrounded by faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, I can still hear the roar of the Packard engines at night. I can still feel the spray of Solomon seawater on my face. I can still smell the gunpowder and diesel exhaust. And most of all, I still feel proud that I was a part of something revolutionary, something that changed naval art forever. We were the guys who became men on those wooden boats, fighting a war that we hadn't started but were determined to end. We attacked from the dark because that's where we were strongest. Our speed and surprise gave us an advantage there. The Japanese have learned to be afraid of the dark, which they once owned. They realized that American ingenuity can turn any disadvantage into an advantage. This is the legacy of PT boats, not just sunk ships or won battles, but proof that free people fighting for their freedom can overcome any tyranny. We were small, fast, and deadly. We were the secret weapon that remained secret just long enough to turn the tide of the war. We were the Mosquito fleet that destroyed the empire, one torpedo after another. The Japanese were stunned by the secret American PT boats because they represented everything that the Imperial Navy did not expect from the Americans. Innovative thinking, aggressive tactics, and a willingness to risk everything on an untested concept. By the time they realized the threat we posed, it was already too late. The shadows they once ruled now belonged to us. And from those shadows, we struck without mercy until the rising sun finally set over Japan's Pacific Empire.